Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining me today. Today, we are going to be talking about leading while grieving. This is our fourth episode in our first season of talking about grief. And today, we're going to talk about moving your grief to relief through hope. Okay. Ah, whoop. All right, so here we are. Welcome to episode 4, Leading While Grieving, Moving Your Grief to Relief Through Hope. And this is going to be an acronym, obviously, as you can see, with my many years of HR and training and development. We love our acronyms, so had to use a HOPE method that I'm going to share more about with you. Today, we're going to talk about first the 5 myths of the hidden realities of grief, which is going to set us up nicely as to the HOPE method and how this particular method that I've come up with can really support you in overcoming those myths and hidden realities of grief, as well as creating a healthy, loving, and of service grieving healing plan for yourself. We'll talk about what's next. What do we do with this information? And then give you the opportunity to share your questions with me. My name is Alison Nail-Malone. I am a credentialed end-of-life doula, or what is also known as a death doula. So I went through certification, I went through testing to test my knowledge and skills with it. So I am a credentialed end-of-life doula. I'm also a credentialed coach. I have been an executive and leadership and life coach for a little over 10 years. I also have a very thriving business called Malone Consultants Group, and then recently opened up this company called Mysteria. And what my role, what my desire to make an impact in the world with Mysteria, as well as being an end-of-life doula and grief educator and coach, is to create those sacred and safe spaces for the dying loved one and their community to die a good death with dignity, love, and support. The reason why I even had went down this road in the first place, first, where did Mysteria come from? That's basically a term that was rooted from the Greek goddess who pours into those who are experiencing deep loss and grief from the death of a loved one. And I went down this path. You can see in the middle is my dad, and I'm on the left and my sister's on the right. And my dad, I was his main caretaker. I was his medical advocate, made sure that he had housing, medical care, mental health care, and a community around him as much as possible. And he was a challenging person to deal with, but I loved my dad, and I wanted to make sure that other caregivers or other loved ones of the dying loved one had the tools, resources, and knowledge to support them so that both sides, the dying individual and the community that love and cares for that dying individual, has the knowledge, tools, and resources available to them so that they can totally be present within the dying process with their loved one. And so for me, why I created Mysteria was really to provide meaningful end-of-life services so that caregivers and their loved ones have the emotional, physical, spiritual, and mental support needed during the dying process. We prepare families for what's to come. We wrap our arms around them and coach caregivers to navigate one of life's most difficult moments. And we also have individual, family, and women group programs to facilitate this. We work with women who are the caregivers of an aging parent or loved one and still have to hold on to all of the roles that they have. And she feels like there's nothing left for her. We also work with the individual preparing for the end of their life transition and want to ensure that their wishes are known and followed. And then we also support nonprofit leaders who experience repeated grief because of the work that they give to our communities. So take a look at the pictures that you see on the screen. When you think about having to describe your grief, or perhaps you are not experiencing grief, but you're supporting someone, or you have connection with someone who is experiencing grief, which of these pictures best describes how you envision grief being. And so I'll just give you a moment here. Several of you are mentioning the elephant. Please write in the chat why that's true. And let's see, a few of you have mentioned number 2, just kind of that listless feeling I'm imagining, and grief making you feel tired. So the elephant is something where there's the idea that elephants hold the memory for a long time. And so grief is part of our long-term memory and our long-term being. So what is grief to you? If you're watching the replay, maybe pause here, look at these pictures and write down, why does this picture or pictures represents the way that you see, feel, or experience grief? So let's talk a little bit about what grief is. Grief is a response to loss of any kind. And this could be the individual or a loved one, like your animal companion. It could be the loss of a job. It could be even something that's good, like maybe you got promoted or you're moving to your dream home in a totally different community. That is experiencing a loss of some kind. So even good things can create grief as well. Grief is evidence of your love of a person, of your animal companion, of a relationship. When you experience grief, it's because you experienced love. And also, grief is transformational. It transforms you mentally, physically, emotionally, even biologically. Grief transforms us. So if you're here watching live, type a 1 in the chat if that sounds relatable to you, or if you've ever heard of the 5 or 6 stages of grief. Yeah, most of us have in some form or fashion. So I want you to think about grief in this way. Grief transforms the way we see and how we experience the world. As I have gone through my own grieving journey, when my dad died in July of 2020, as I have held sacred communities for those that are grieving, those that are at end of life, even in my own community of my people and my friends, I have witnessed every single time that grief transforms the way we experience the world, the way that we experience ourselves, the way that we experience relationships with people that we thought would be there for us, or the ones that showed up for us would never be the ones we thought would be there, or total strangers. And so grief transforms everything. And when we deny that truth, grief takes a different form within us that makes it difficult to heal gracefully, to heal messily, to heal in service to ourselves. So in this moment, if you are currently experiencing grief because the loss of a loved one, or if you're someone that is supporting someone in your community that is experiencing grief, I'm just going to ask that you take this moment right now and close your eyes. If closing your eyes does not feel safe or you're not able to do that, maybe just focus on your eye sight and attention on one object in front of you, or just in your mind's eye, focusing on a light or your person. And, you may want to put your hand over your heart. Take a deep breath in and out, and just envision this person or this loved one, and just send them so much love. Thank you. So let's talk about the 5 myths of grief before we talk about the HOPE method. Myth number 1 is that grief happens in stages. Now remember, I asked if you had ever heard of the stages of grief. Well, the reality is that grief does not happen in stages. In fact, it happens in phases. I'm sure many of you have heard of the author Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. And in her book on death and dying, the theory that grief happens in 5 predictable stages: anger, denial, bargaining, depression, and acceptance, is found in a lot of places in our culture. But the reality is even Miss Kubler-Ross did not mean for those to be taken in a linear fashion, that we move through these stages, and once we move through these stages, you are healed. The fact is, while there are many aspects to grief, there is no singular grief process. Every person grieves uniquely in their own way, depending on the internal, so that emotional and psychological, or the external, which is our support systems and our community factors. Bottom line, grief is not an experience that fits neatly into assigned category or stages. And so Elizabeth Kubler-Ross had these first five: denial, anger, bargaining, depression, and acceptance. David Kessler, who helped rewrite some of this with Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, also wrote that this final stage was meaning, that we find meaning in it. And again, it is not a final stage that we go through. It is a phase that we experience over and over and over. And then recently, Marissa Renee Lee, who wrote this beautiful book called Grief is Love, added the lead up grief, which is that anticipatory grief that we feel even before the death happens. Myth number 2 is that time heals all wounds. And I swear, if I hear that one more time, I'm sure you can probably relate to that. There is a common cliche that in the world of grief, that time heals all wounds. You may have heard this repeated or repeated it to yourself. The underlying assumption is that with time, your grief, like a physical wound, heals and just simply goes away. There may be a scar left behind, but healing eventually takes place. But the fact is this: grief has no timeline. This doesn't mean that the intensity of the experience will last forever. Instead, think of grief as something that will evolve over time, becoming more manageable and less intense with the support of family, friends, and the community that you're a part of or that you seek out. Removing assumptions about a timeline of grief helps us to be more prepared for when those unexpected difficult days come now and in the future. And grief is messy. We would love for it to be in this, this V-shaped stages of grief that we go through these things and then we're done. And because there's no timeline to grief, it's messy and it can be all over the place in one day, or you just might be in one of those spaces for a month. And it actually brings a sense of relief that there is no timeline to grief. Your grief will always be a part of your life now, because you will always not have that person in your life now. And to make the assumption that grief is going to go away, it makes an assumption that it didn't matter if this person was here in our present and physical life or not. That's just not true. The third myth of grief is that the goal of healing your grief is closure. This myth assumes that grief can be compartmentalized simply by, like, if we're closing the door as if it never happened in the first place. When closure is the goal, the focus is about moving on from someone's death to get on with our lives. But here's the fact: we don't just get over it. And we don't get over it in 3 days. We don't get over it in 3 months. In fact, we don't get over it ever. The intensity lessens throughout our lifetime, but grief is a lifelong journey and process. It can appear in cycles and present itself intensely, even years after the death. Instead of closure, what if our goal of grief should be integrating it into our lives, strengthening our continuing bond to the person who's died, finding ways to keep them in our lives, sharing our stories and processing our feelings? Because here's the reality: whatever you believe, what happens to us after life after death, or whatever happens to us after death, that person is still with us, because we still have our memories of them. We still have them in our heart. We still have pictures. We may have posted different things on social media. That person is still with us, just not in its physical form. Myth number 4: kids can't handle grief. Deep within many of us is the drive to protect our children from potential harm. We do this by talking about the person who's died or acting as if nothing has happened. This is an instinctual response. Our young do need protecting, and death is scary and it's complicated and it's confusing. So how can our kids understand, and why expose them to this painful experience? So it's hard not to see why parents respond in this way when loss happens. But here's the fact: Children need honesty. They need to better understand what is happening when someone dies. Now, we don't have to, tell all the messy details, but we don't need to give them white lies or sugarcoat the death of a pet or acquaintance or a loved one to protect our kids. By doing so, it really inhibits their ability to fully process what's happened. Giving our kids the time, the attention, and the tools to help them process their grief, just like you, empowers them to develop healthy coping skills and help build resilience today, especially for when they experience death in the future. And myth number 5 is this, that there are right and wrong ways to grieve. We experience grief in different ways, but we assume that it has the same effect on everyone. In reality, no grief is the same. It's as diverse as we all are, and that's why there are there's quite a few different models of grief. They give you a good idea of what to expect after the loss of a loved one, but they can't predict its effect on you. Remember that next time someone tries to define your grief or tell you that you'll be over it in 6 months. So now I want to introduce you to the H.O.P.E method for grief and healing. This is a method that I've come up with based on the hours and the multiple hours of being in grief coaching, the years of coaching people who've experienced grief as professionals, as well as my own healing journey. And so here's an overview of it, and let's go through each section. And HOPE is an acronym. H is for healthy grief shares. O is an opportunity for connection and curiosity. P is personal and unique, and E is to exercise meaningful rituals. So let's start with H, healthy grief shares. We either tap into our existing community or we find one to connect with. This is where healthy grief needs to be shared. As grievers, this can actually be one of the hardest components for hope in our healing, is to express openly what you need. I need someone to just listen and not make it okay. I need to rest more, so I'm going to ask my partner and taking the night shift with the kids. I need more time outdoors, so I'm going to ask a friend of mine to meet me once a week for the first month just to walk with me outside. Grief heals best in community. We have to express what we need because the reality is most people don't know what we need, even in the best of times, let alone in life's most difficult times. O is for the opportunity for connection and curiosity. Our grief opens the doors for opportunities to find connection and to be curious. We have the opportunity to spend more time with ourselves, to connect to our grief and the emotions that are tied to our grief. We also get very curious because our world changes and it's in a weird limbo. It feels like the world has changed for us, and yet it remains the same for everyone else. Everyone runs their lives the same way it did before the death, but not us. So here is where, as grievers, we say, I hold space for myself with gentleness and grace. I hold myself accountable to be curious in times that I feel angry or resentment towards others. When their lives seem normal, when my people didn't show up for me, I'm going to the way that I needed them to. So I'm going to ask myself, what is actually true? What else could be the reason? What do I need in this moment to ease my anger? I believe that grief is a gateway to curiosity, to deepen curiosity of our own lives. Often we search for meaning here, strengthen our beliefs and our core values as well, such as saying things like, I hold myself gently with love and get curious about the meaning of my grief. P is for my grief is personal and unique. While you and I may have had a parent die, your pain and your grief is different than mine. I can relate in some way, and we do speak a similar grief language and mindset, but everything about my experience is unique to me and yours is to yours. We have the opportunity to learn more about ourselves, more about our pain, more about our needs, more about our boundaries. We also learn that healing takes time and cannot be rushed. We learn that grief has to be paid attention to because it's kind of sneaky. Its sneaky nature is to rear back up and demand your undivided attention. So here we learn small and loving ways to hold our heart during those waves of grief. And the E is for exercising meaningful practices. This could be journaling, having a dedicated space for our loved one, or maybe it's celebrating by raising a glass of wine to honor a loved one. It could even be for 15 minutes a day for 1 month, I'm going to let all the emotions come up about my grief, the rage, the anger, the sadness, the laughter, the sorrow, and I'm going to let it show up big. It could even be dedicating the last 10 minutes of your day before you go to bed and acknowledging those small moments of happiness or joy. Or maybe it was just one moment when your song came on the radio and you bobbed your head to the tune. Here we as grievers say, I see my own pain. I see my loved one in my daily practices. I see the moments of happiness or joy today. This is where you get the opportunity to create a meaningful practice during your grief, can really elevate some of the tears that breaks our heart and inserts a sacred heart connection to yourself and also to your loved one. So we've had the opportunity to talk about what is grief and how is that defined, the 5 myths of grief that we just need to put away, let it go, and tell people that's a myth. And then we start to move into modeling a healing journey that follows the H.O.P.E method. So I'm curious for you, what was most meaningful from today's discussion? So if you are joining us live, just type in the chat what was most meaningful for you. If you are watching the replay, you can do one of 2 things. One, you can pause here and just journal this out, or you can email me when you watch this video or listen to this. Share with me what you found to be most meaningful about the discussion today. While you are doing that, I want to share with you what's next, how you can be supported by the resources that Nassiria has available. One is we do provide 3-month, 6-month, and 12-month coaching packages designed to work with you one-on-one to explore your grief, to heal your heart, and to provide you a community of people that know your language. We also will be launching soon a group coaching program designed for women who are in these roles called Leading While Grieving. This will be a sacred community, again, designed for women specifically who are the caregivers and who have nothing left and just need to pour into themselves. And then lastly, we also provide end-of-life planning and services. So we do end-of-life doula work. We sit down with the family and create mediation or talk through a plan of service and of support. So if any of that sounds like you would be interested in exploring a little bit more, because you've either attended here live or you're watching the recording, you get the opportunity to sign up for a free 30-minute discovery session to see if any of those 3 would best support you or maybe someone you know in their grieving or end-of-life journey. And here's how you can contact me. You can go to my website, which is mymisseria, mymisseria.com. And there's a contact me option. You can also email me at Alison, Alison, at mymisseria.com. Let me know that you would like to have a 30-minute discovery session. I'll get it scheduled and we'll have the opportunity to talk either by phone or virtually if you'd like through Zoom. Thank you so much for being a part of today's conversation, and I look forward to connecting with you soon.